Today, we're diving into the story of Hobart. Now, think about this for a second. A city that started out as a brutal prison colony, literally squeezed between a mountain and a river, and somehow grew into this modern capital at what feels like the very edge of the world. So, how on earth did that happen? Let's get into it. You know, that one sentence just nails it, doesn't it? Its whole story, right from the very beginning, has been shaped by this unique, kind of isolated geography. It's a city that's always been defined by its natural boundaries.
I mean, just look at this timeline. It shows a pretty staggering contrast, right? For 40,000 years, this was indigenous land. And then, boom. And what's really just a blink of an eye in historical terms? A few decades, European ships show up, the coast gets charted, and by 1804, a British penal settlement is founded. The speed of that change is just immense.
So that first phase of Hobart's European history is really defined by one thing. It was a prison, one of the most remote and frankly feared penal colonies in the entire British Empire. This wasn't some grand new world of opportunity. Nope, this was a place of exile, plain and simple.
And this slide gives you a real feel for that early reality. Now, this is based on paintings by actual convict artists, and you can see this tiny, fragile little settlement. Just a few cottages, a few ships in the cove, and all of it is just dwarfed by the immense presence of Mount Wellington. You can almost feel how fragile it was. It's like this tiny little toehold of an empire clinging to the edge of a vast, intimidating wilderness.
And yet, somehow, it grew incredibly fast. By the 1830s, the population hits 10,000. And you can see from the art here that things were already changing. It wasn't just about convicts anymore. Free settlers were showing up, and money, a lot of it, was starting to pour in from the booming whaling industry. You're starting to see a real town take shape.
Okay, so let's move into the mid-19th century and see how this all starts to build into something more. Because that raw outpost is about to transform. It's starting to develop the institutions, and yeah, the conflicts, of a proper colonial capital.
So there was an artist named John Glover, and he captures this really beautiful, peaceful moment. You see Aboriginal Tasmanians dancing on the shore of the Derwent River. And way off in the distance, you can just make out the growing settlement of Hobart Town. When you look at it, it seems almost idyllic, right?
But that serene painting is hiding a really brutal truth. You see, as Glover was creating this image, the Black War was raging across the island. Government agents were forcibly removing the last of the indigenous people from their land. So that makes Glover's art something way more than just a pretty landscape. It's this incredibly poignant and tragic record of a culture right on the very brink of being erased. And that brutality, it wasn't just happening out on the frontier. Back in town, this place existed, the Cascades Female Factory. It was the colony's only dedicated prison, just for women, and, well, it was a place of just profound misery.
Life in here was a complete nightmare. Women, some of them convicted for crimes as small as stealing bread, faced solitary confinement and relentless, back-breaking labor. And maybe the cruelest part of all, their children were often taken away from them. This was the brutal reality for so many of these women.
And the scale of this place, it's just staggering. Thousands of women passed through these walls before the factory finally closed. Their stories are literally woven into the fabric of the state, and a lot of their descendants are still living in Tasmania today.
Yet, even with all that hardship, the colony was maturing. In 1856, they hit a huge milestone. Tasmania achieves self-government. And this grand sandstone Parliament House, this building is the ultimate symbol of that shift. Hobart isn't just a jail anymore. It's a self-governing capital. The economy was changing too. By the 1870s, the population hits 25,000. And you can see here the engine of its growth was really shifting. You've got jam factories, timber mills, breweries. All these new industries were driving the city forward, creating this bustling Victorian city at the bottom of the world.
So how does this isolated Victorian city make the jump into the 20th century? Well, this next phase is really all about connection and modernization. We're talking about new technologies that are going to shrink the distance and just change daily life forever.
And wow, the changes came fast. First, you've got Federation in 1901, which turns the colony into an official state. Then electric trams start crisscrossing the city, connecting all the suburbs. You start seeing the first motor cars on the streets, right alongside the horse-drawn carts. And Elizabeth Street becomes this bustling commercial heart. Hobart is finally plugging into the modern world.
Now, not all of Hobart was these grand Victorian buildings. Down on the waterfront, there was a working-class neighborhood called Wapping,
It had a bit of a rough reputation, you know? Outsiders would often just dismiss it, call it a shanty town.
But if you actually looked closer, that just wasn't true. These were solid homes, made of brick and stone, where dock workers and sailors and their families all lived. It was a crowded, loud, but deeply tight-knit community. It was a real neighborhood, with its own vibe, its own history, its own identity.
But the 20th century also brought the turmoil of global conflict. The world wars would reach all the way to this distant port city, and they were going to demand a heavy price and completely reshape its future.
Just imagine this scene. It's October 20th, 1914. Thousands of people are crammed onto the docks, waving goodbye as all these young Tasmanian soldiers board ships, heading for a war they all think is going to be over by Christmas. For way, way too many of them, this was the last time they would ever see home. Despite the Great Depression and the wars, the city just kept growing. By the 1940s, as World War II is raging, the population is getting close to 60,000. Hobart is becoming a significant little city, and it's still a city that's very much defined by its port.
And that port was absolutely vital during the Second World War. This image shows workers just racing to load crates of Tasmanian apples onto ships. And these weren't just any apples, they were headed to England, a crucial food source for a nation at war. So you see, the local economy here, the simple act of growing and shipping apples, was directly tied into the global fight for survival.
Which brings us to our final section. Now, the post-war era was a time of huge optimism, a real desire for everything modern. But for Hobart, this idea of progress would end up coming at a really devastating cost to the city's own history.
So yeah, what did happen to Wapping? That tight-knit waterfront community we were just talking about. The neighborhood that had been there for over a century. Where did it go?
The answer lies in this one idea: urban renewal. In the 1950s and 60s, city planners all over the world basically saw old, working-class neighborhoods not as living history, but as blight, something messy that needed to be cleared away to make room for modern, efficient infrastructure. And this was the result. By the 1970s, Wapping was completely gone, demolished. An entire neighborhood of homes and streets and families was just replaced by concrete, storage tanks, and warehouses. A living, breathing community was just scattered. It now only exists in old photos and in people's memories.
You know, this whole story really gets at a central tension in the life of Hobart, and really in so many cities. And it forces us to ask a really tough question. When a city erases its past to build its future, what is truly lost?